Uh, Hello, everyone. Today I'll be talking about concurrent data structures made easy, which is a joint work made by me and all these amazing people that you see on screen right now. So let's get started. So suppose we have some sequential data structure, and multiple threads need to read from and write to it concurrently. So what can we do in this case? A simple solution is to install a mutual exclusion lock on the whole data structure. That way threads can only access the data structure one by one by each acquiring the lock. This is coarse-grained concurrency. It has some advantages. Well, it's obviously thread safe because only one thing can access the data structure at any given time. It's easy to implement, but it also has some disadvantages, namely high lock contention, and you can't parallelize operations inside the data structure. So, can we do better than this? Well, one way is to get rid of the mutex lock entirely, and instead redesign our sequential data structure completely to be concurrent and lock-free by being more selective with where we synchronize with smaller, more fine-grained locks. We can get much better performance. We call this fine-grained concurrency. It sounds pretty obvious. And the advantages are the data structure can be lock-free and operations can actually be done in parallel. But of course, we have disadvantages as usual. It is hard to design, it's hard to reason about, and it is hard to debug with non-deterministic bugs. So it's really not easy. People write entire books on how to make these things. And in terms of reasoning, their form of verification is still a very active field of research. So is there an easier way to get a decently performing concurrent data structure, but at a lesser design cost? So introducing batch parallelism, which is based on one crucial insight, that handling a batch of known operations is easier than handling a stream of arbitrary operations. So in this paradigm, instead of directly operating on the underlying data structure, threads submit their operations to a batch so that each batch contains multiple operations. Then we can launch batches one by one on the data structure, and within each batch, knowing the operations beforehand, we should be able to more easily parallelize them. So again, advantages. Versus a coarse-grained data structure, we have less lock contention since the lock doesn't have to be acquired for every request. And we can process operations in parallel. And versus a fine-grained concurrent data structure, we can get a simpler design for, well, a batch data structure. But we still have some problems. Here, you can notice that the threads are not exactly operating on the data structure, and we will need to manually batch the operations together to make a batch that we can process. This is called explicit batching. This is additional work for the user of a batch parallel data structure. And this means that it is not a drop-in replacement for the coarse-grained or fine-grained data structure that we've seen previously. What we'd want instead is to somehow make all the batching logic transparent. That is, it is not visible to the user, and from their perspective, it should just be like calling a classic direct style function on the data structure. And so that is one of the main questions that we are trying to answer in this work. How to implement implicit batching. That's what we call making the batching transparent. And second, how to parallelize operations within a batch. Because while it's nice to have the intuition that handling a batch of known operations is easier, we still need to actually figure out how to do that. So let's start with the first question. And our key idea here is that it is possible to do a lightweight implementation of implicit batching using only basic concurrency primitives, namely async await. So how does this work? Suppose you have a thread that needs to run some kind of operation on an implicitly or transparently batched data structure. It calls its operations, and then what should happen behind the scenes? Well, we can wrap this operation and add a promise to it, and the thread will not continue the logic after the operation until the promise is fulfilled. This wrap operation is then submitted to the current batch of operations, and the current thread that submitted the operation attempts to launch the batch of operations. If it is not successful because, say, another batch is currently running, it will just spin on the wrap promise. And if it is successful, then all the batch operations will be run in parallel, of course, and we can fulfill the promises of all the operations in that batch and allow their respective threads to continue by fulfilling all their promises. And that's how you can create a fully transparent batching mechanism. And remember, everything here except calling the operation is hidden away. So from the perspective of someone using the batch data structure, all they should see is a direct style call of insert or search or whatever operation that you want to do on the data structure. So that is our first key idea. And so let's move on to the second question, how to parallelize operations within a batch. And so our key idea here is that there are some sequential strategies that we can use to batch parallelize entire classes of data structures. So let's look at a case study. We call this the split join strategy, and it comes in a few simple steps. One, we split the data structure into independent sub-data structures. We modify each split data structure in parallel. And then we rejoin the modified data structure together. So let's look at an example of how this might work on an actual data structure. Meet the red-black tree. It is an approximately balanced binary tree where each node is either red or black. It has empty leaves at the bottom layer, and it supports search, insert, and delete operations in log n time complexity. So to maintain this complexity, the red-black tree needs to maintain certain invariants. One, every leaf is black. Two, if a node is red, both its children must be black. And three, paths from a given node to any of its descendant leaves must have the same number of black nodes. Okay, if that went over your head a little bit, that's okay. The important thing to remember is that to maintain these invariants, we need to rebalance the tree after each update. This involves shuffling the nodes around and recoloring them. This rebalancing occurs recursively, bottom up, and can go through the entire height of the tree. Hence, the challenge with making a fine-grained concurrent version, as we can't just simply insert while rebalancing is underway without more complicated concurrent logic. Now, let's see how we can batch parallelize this. Suppose we have this red-black tree, and we want to insert a bunch of elements, the array of numbers on top, into the tree. This is a batch of insert operations. So how would we proceed? Well, we can split the tree and the batch of insert operations into two. We can now run the insertion operations on the two new trees in parallel on, say, two cores, as if they are independent from each other. But what if you want even more parallelism on 4 cores, for example? Well, you can split again. And now let's insert all of this. And now we have 4 red-black trees with all the extra elements. The only thing left now is to join them together again. We join the 2 on the left side and 2 on the right side, like so. And then we join those 2 as well to get the final tree with all the nodes inserted. So to sum this up, for a data structure that follows this pattern, we will only need to implement a split and join function. There's no concurrent programming involved. And all the rest can be made generic and pre-implemented, for instance, by functors in OCaml or traits in Rust. And of course, red-black trees are not the only data structures that we have. For split join, we also have the AVL tree and the tree app. And of course, split join is also not the only batching strategy that we have. We have another strategy or pattern called expose repair, which covers some other search structures like the Van M de Boas tree, the XFast trie, and the YFast trie. And finally, we have some data structures that don't fit nicely into either strategies and were implemented in an ad hoc manner directly on top of the batching interface. And so that is the second key idea of our work. So here are some implementation details. First, we implemented this as a library in OCaml 5 with about 230 lines of code for implicit batching and about 150 to 200 lines of code for the generic part of each batching strategy. And we implemented all this using only concurrency primitives, async await, from the domains lib library. And as a proof of concept, we also implemented implicit batching in Rust, which took about 150 lines of code. Now, you might be curious about how our batch data structures perform. So this is our test setup. We benchmarked our OCaml implementation. Each of our benchmarks involves a data structure with 2 million initial elements, and we benchmark 1 million concurrent operations on top of that. And each operation is one concurrent task submitted to the OCaml task queue. Now this is the result we got with our batch red-black tree. So the y-axis of these plots is throughput, or how many operations are performed per second. The x-axis represents the number of domains. That's kind of OCaml lingo for the number of cores used. And the 4 graphs represent different workloads. We have an insert-only workload on the top left, a searches-only workload on the top right, and 2 mixed workload with a 50-50 and 90-10 search-to-insert operation split. So a few things we notice is that in every benchmark, our batch implementation actually significantly outperforms the coarse-grained benchmark from 2 domains onward, with the gap widening as we increase the number of domains up to a certain point. So we have been the coarse-grained implementation. Performance levels out for high numbers of cores, though. We can conjecture that this is caused by a few factors, namely the overhead of batching the operations. We also note that relative to the sequential benchmarks, insertion-heavy workloads perform more favorably with the batch parallel insert-only throughput or matching sequential throughput for higher cores. And so we conjecture that this is due to the search operation being lighter than insertion, and therefore the batching overhead would matter less for the insert-only benchmark. Well, despite the roughly equal or less performance than the sequential implementation, you can still see the utility of this batch parallel data structure for situations where you have no choice but to implement some sort of concurrency. And here, just very quickly, some performance graphs for our other data structures: the AVL tree, the triad, the Van M. de Bois tree, the XFast trie, the YFast trie. And here we have the result of the skip list, for which we have also benchmarked a fine-grained version. We see that the fine-grained version significantly outperforms our batch version in all workloads. It also scales very well throughout the full number of domains that we tested on. While this might seem like a crushing defeat, we know that the fine-grained version is significantly more intricate than our batch parallel version and uses locks in a manner as to allow nodes to be removed lazily, which is a pattern that is notoriously hard to reason about when trying to prove linearizability. So while we lose out on performance to a well-thought-out fine-grained implementation, we are still getting a decent showing by the batch data structure at a fraction of the design cost. And finally, as a bonus, we have also implemented a basic batch version of a data log solver. Here, we are wrapping our batching mechanism over a popular OCaml data log library. Our optimization for a batch of operations here is just the following: split the queries and insert, dispatch the queries in parallel, and then do the insert sequentially. So for this experiment, we implemented a graph connectedness constraint system on top of the data log database. Queries are about the connectedness of 2 nodes. Inserting is adding an edge between 2 nodes. We ran a sample benchmark involving a 90-10 split of 50,000 queries and inserts on an initial graph with 200 nodes and 30,000 edges. And this is the result. We know that even with our very simple optimization, we are getting significantly better performance compared to the coarse-grained implementation. So to finish things off, here are some takeaways. First, batching is an easier way to implement parallel processing. Implicit batching can be implemented simply using async await. Split join, thirdly, batching strategies like split join, expose repair, can allow for concurrent data structures without writing concurrent code. And so if you want to find out more, you can find our OCaml library here. You can read our paper here. And thank you so much for listening.
Okay. Hello, and thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask, one thing wasn't very clear to me, but maybe I just didn't pay attention enough. What sort of operations do you schedule? Do you like schedule inserting a single element, or like do you schedule more complicated operations? And if you don't, then do you think that scheduling more complicated operations could help with some algorithms?
Okay, so if I understand correctly, you asked whether we implemented simple operations like insert, right?
I mean, what sort of operations do you actually batch, right?
Oh, okay. So for our data structures, we mainly benchmark basic operations like search and insert, and those are the ones that we implemented.
And do you think that more complex operations could help in some cases, or not?
Could help in some cases in terms of performance?
Yes.
Actually, that is a very interesting question. Maybe because if you look at the performance here, say you have the red black tree and you look at the throughput, you can say you can look at the sequential line in particular, and say compare that to say what we get here with the skip list. It's the same axis, and you can actually see like the sequential line being much lower, so like lower throughput and a operation that takes longer. So actually, batching performs better on like when your operation takes a bit more time. So yes, maybe more complex operations will lend themselves better to this batching paradigm.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. It's a very clever and I think promising technique. How much do you think, with regards to the point of being slower than sequential for the red-black tree, how much do you think that's due to caching, like cache misses?
Sorry?
How much do you think this is due to cache performance? Like the sequential would be more cache friendly, right? Whereas if you split the tree, you have a bigger working set.
We haven't looked too deeply into the effects of caching on this, but we have run a few experiments, and we think that most of the current performance is due to the overhead of batching, because while it is not shown here, we also benchmark explicit batching, which we just submit like a whole batch of all of our operations, and that actually scales pretty linearly with the number of cores. So yes, unfortunately, the main overhead here is the batching mechanism.
Cool. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question about the implementation of the batching mechanism. You said that when a thread sees that no operation is currently running, then it adds its operation to the batch and then starts executing the entire batch.
Okay.
So how do you avoid the deadlock when a bunch of threads submit operations when there's nothing happening with the data structure? Sorry, a bunch of threads submit operations while there is a batch that's already being processed, and then there is silence, and how do you process that final batch?
Oh, the final batch. Oh, okay. Yes, yes, that is something we implemented. Is because okay. So what we did is that whenever a thread has launched a batch, at the end of that batch, it actually tries to launch the batch again to pick up any pending operations.
Thank you.
No. Last question. No. Okay. Cool. Thank you very much. Let's. Oh, okay. Ask last question. Yes, Christian.
Deletion operations. We have implemented them. We have not benchmarked them though, but they should be able to follow a similar pattern to sort of what we did with insert operations. On cache. Right.
All right. Thank you very much.